Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Joe Price. I'm one of the deacons here at Poplar Springs Missionary Baptist Church. I'd like to thank Pastor Freeman and the Christian Enrichment Ministry for the opportunity to conduct Lesson 4 for November. Today's lesson is entitled, Sinners into Servants. Before we get started, let us go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Lord, please give me fresh eyes to see and a bold voice to tell of your wondrous deeds, your mighty works, and your answered promises as we study your word. Please give me the words to speak, to make known your gospel, that they may be meaningful, beneficial, and bring understanding to each of us as we study your word today. It is in the mighty name of Jesus that I do pray. Thank you, dear God. Amen. So, today's Bible basis is coming from Genesis 28:10 through 22. And it focuses on God transforms sinners into servants. And you know, this is a daily affair, as we are all sinners saved by grace. So, with this, our memory verse is coming from Genesis 28:15. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. That is the Lord speaking to Jacob. So, as we get into some of the things, before we get into the lesson today, let's do a short recap on the prior lessons that have been conducted in November. And I certainly would like to thank Deaconess Arnold and also Deacon McNeil for the great teaching that they provided this month. So in lesson 1 was entitled Step by Step. The Bible basis was from 2 Thessalonians 3:1 through 5 and 2 John 1:4 through 11. The memory verse was 2 John 1:6. And this is love, that we walk in obedience to his commands. As you have heard from the beginning, his command is that we walk in love. So what did we learn from the lesson? To walk in love, obedience, and truth. And lesson 2 was entitled, Following Jesus is Better. The Bible basis came from James 4:1 through 10. The memory verse was James 4:8. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your heart, you double-minded. See, we learned from this lesson to say yes to God and no to the world. Lesson 3 was entitled, Love and Serve. The Bible basis was from Matthew 25:31 and 40 through 46, and the memory verse was Matthew 25:40. The king will reply, Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. We learned from the lesson that we serve God by serving those in need. So today's lesson is coming from the book of Genesis, which means origin or generation. See, Genesis contains some of the most well-known narratives in the Bible, beginning, of course, with creation and ending with the death of Joseph. Okay? So it tracks the early history of the world, focusing in on the stories of 5 men, Adam, Noah, and the 3 patriarchs of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God chose these men to play primary roles in this story for all mankind. See, if we fast forward from Adam and Noah, we find in Genesis that God promises Abraham a land of his own with a great multitude of offsprings. He brings Abram to Canaan, the land God later gives to the Israelites, Exodus 33:1. See, God changes Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of many. Abraham became the father of the Jewish people and the model of righteousness before God because of his obedience. See, Abraham and his wife Sarah, in their old age, they have a son named Isaac. God chooses to fulfill his promise of offspring through Isaac, even though Abraham's firstborn was Ishmael. Yet, God tests Abram's faith, and he tells him to sacrifice his son promise on an altar. So just as Abraham is about to follow through on the sacrifice of Isaac, the angel of the Lord stops him and commands his trusting obedience to God. Okay? So Isaac holds the same faith of his father as he grows up. He marries a relative, Rebekah, and they have twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Okay? Although Esau is the firstborn, Jacob tricks him out of both his inheritance and the blessings from his father. See, God, again, he chooses his younger son, in this case, Jacob, to carry out his covenantal blessings. Later in Jacob's life, after God had given him abundant possessions and children, God changes Jacob's name to Israel, meaning who prevails with God. See, we will explore this actually in today's Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 22. Okay? Now, in the closing chapters of Genesis, it relates how God works through Israel's second youngest son, Joseph, to save his family and all of Egypt from a 7-year famine. So, as we explore Genesis 28, there are 3 phrases in the chapter. 1, suitable spouse. 2, significant sleep. And 3, spiritual start. So today's lesson, though, which is verses 10 through 22, will focus just on 2 of these, the physical sleep and the spiritual start. So, with that, Genesis 28:1, it kind of begins by stating that Isaac called Jacob and blessed him. See, this comes after Jacob's deception and act of treachery, which caused Isaac to literally tremble in panic, Genesis 27 and 33. See, Jacob has stolen his blessing from Esau, his brother, okay? Although Isaac made peace with those events on some level, he actually blessed Jacob here and in the coming verses because he knew exactly who he was talking to and dealing with, this deceptive Jacob, okay? See, in Genesis 27 and 41, Isaac's wife, Rebekah, she became aware of Esau's intent to murder his brother Jacob. And this is because of vengeance, okay? He was upset because of all of what Jacob had done to him. So first, Rebekah urges Jacob to run away and stay with her brother in Mesopotamia until Esau's fiery vengeance had kind of passed, Genesis 27 and 43. Next, she goes to Isaac and manipulates him to send Jacob away, convincing him that it would be a terrible thing for Jacob to marry a local Canaanite woman, Genesis 27:46. And she was indicating how miserable that she and Jacob both had been by Esau's Hittite wives. So Jacob should find a wife among her brother's people to solidify the family identity. Well, Isaac acted on Rebekah's suggestion, probably unaware of Esau's plan to kill Jacob. So Isaac insists that Jacob not marry a Canaanite woman. It's very similar to the requirements that his own father Abraham had placed on him in Genesis 24 and 3. See, Abraham did not want Isaac to assimilate into the local populace and marry a Canaanite woman because the Canaanite women worshiped false gods. Abraham wanted Isaac to marry a righteous woman who would help him remain faithful to the living God and who would teach their children the truth. See, the jeopardy that Isaac and Jacob face has to do more with the survival of their family. And see, therefore, Jacob is sent from the land to save his life, okay? Jacob receives a blessing from Isaac, Genesis 28 and 4, before departing for Pan-Anaram, which was located roughly about 550 miles from Beersheba. Okay, even in the midst of Jacob's deception, God was at work to keep the line of succession distinct. Okay, so when Esau discovered that Jacob had departed to avoid marrying a Canaanite woman, he attempted to do the same to please his father. So he emulated Jacob, by going to Pan-Anaram which is in Genesis 28:7. He went there to get a wife to avoid the Canaanite women that his father Isaac disapproved of in Genesis 28:8. Yet Esau went to Ishmael and married one of his daughters, Genesis 28:9. However, Esau never really realized that this wasn't the righteous action that God wanted. Okay, sadly, until the time Esau had been up to this time, he had been unaware that his Canaanite wives had actually displeased his parents. Okay, and so this attempt now was to try to regain his father's blessing by marrying a daughter of Ishmael. Although it was a case of doing evil, multiplying, with his multiple wives and everything, that good might come out of it. Okay, now let's get into the verses of Genesis 28:10 through 22, our verses for the day. And we've also entitled this Jacob's Dream at Bethel. Okay, so beginning with verse 10, Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and he laid down to sleep. See, Jacob's 550-mile journey, from Beersheba to Haran, it really would take him over, a month to travel. Okay, so about 2 to 3 days into his journey, Jacob stopped at this place that was called Luz, which was located about 60 miles or so from Beersheba. Okay, Jacob, now a fugitive, and he was a fugitive from his brother. Okay, he found himself in circumstances so grim that the only pillow he had was a rock, 28:11. So one of the stones under his head. Okay, see, in ancient times, headrests, they were often quite hard. Okay, and sometimes they were actually made out of metal. Okay, see, people were also used to sleeping on the ground. Now, I don't know about you, okay, but it would be hard for me to rest with a rock as a pillow and sleeping on the ground. Okay, but it is amazing how we often get used to luxuries that were not, afforded to our ancestors. And it's also amazing the fact that God can comfort you in the face of all the trials and tribulations. Okay, he can comfort you. And if you can sleep on a rock, you can sleep on hard ground, that's because God comforted him to sleep on that. Okay, let's go to verse 12 here. And it says, he had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, and with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. So we all know hymn number 402. We're climbing Jacob's ladder. See, it's one of the spiritual hymns that has its origins in slavery, emphasizing spiritual growth, our knowledge of God, and also a call to discipleship. See, it implies that God's promise to Jacob will also bless the slaves and lead them to freedom. So, and we won't get into the hymn today, but know that, hymn number 402, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. So, that night, Jacob dreamed that a ladder was set on the ground with its top reaching to the sky, 28:12. See, the dream was really given to assure Jacob that God was present with him and that God intended to bless him, okay? Keeping the promises that was made to his ancestors, Abram, okay, Isaac. This also marked the beginning of Jacob's lifelong relationship with God. So, while Jacob slept, he was watching divine activity at work around him. See, prior to this, all he could see was the mess that he was in, okay? But God opened up his eyes into more of a spiritual reality that really transformed his viewpoint. Okay? So ironically, the first time Jacob truly woke up was when he goes to sleep. See? Okay? So for it is the quietness of inactivity that he hears God. So sometimes we got to sit down, shut up, and be still and listen for God and listen to God. Okay? See, this is the second dream in the Bible in which someone explicitly experiences a revelation from God, Genesis 20:3. And we all know the story about Abimelech. Okay? And we're not going to get into it today, but look up Genesis 20:3 and you'll see that. Okay? So Jacob dreams of a stairway to heaven on which angels descend and ascend, taking the directions from the Lord, who actually stands at the top of the stairs. See, the messengers of God, they're actually using this stairway to travel between realms. It's not a parade or a processional, as we sometimes see this in some of the artwork that we may have around, but it is a sacred portal between the realm where angels, who are the messengers, descend to embark on their errands throughout the earth and ascend when they're returning with reports as to their activity. See, note that God is not descending by the stairs, okay? He's just simply standing beside it, okay? Now let's go to verse 13 and 13 and 14, 13 through 15, okay? It says, "There above stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and the south. All people on earth will be blessed through you and your offsprings. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to the land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." See, God has always been watching over Jacob. Okay, but now Jacob got to see his presence. Okay, see, this is the first time that Jacob heard the promise from God himself. Okay, see, and this information thus became real because he finally realized that it was God's promise, not just his father's or his grandfather's. Okay, and it says, what a blessing it is when God, kind of illuminates his word so that we hear the Spirit speaking personally to us, okay? So in an act of grace, God himself gives the Abrahamic promise directly to Jacob. God now, for the first time, calls himself not only the God of Abraham, but also the God of Isaac. And despite everything, he will also be Jacob's God. Deuteronomy 9:6 says, "No, then it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stubborn people." See, God was not rewarding the people of Israel, or Jacob that is, because of anything they had done. In fact, they'd been disobedient and rebellious toward it. Okay? Rather, he was keeping his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because of his own faithful, righteous character. Okay? Likewise, the Lord does not shower us with his love because we deserve it, but because he is gracious and loving. Okay? Romans 5:8. "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." See, God is blessing us with his grace and his mercy. Okay? So, Jesus, as an example, told a disciple that he would see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. John 1:51. See, Jesus himself is the bridge between heaven and earth. John 14:6. And the only mediator between God and mankind. 1 Timothy 2:5. Okay? Now, just a closer look at 28:15. "Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised." See, God will always stay with us and keep all of his promises to us. Even when we, go through the storms of life, when we wonder if he's really there, he is, okay? And see, at this time, when Jacob's heart was probably filled with regret for the past, the loneliness in the present, and the uncertainty about the future, God graciously made a covenant with him as he had with Abraham and Isaac. Notice the promise of companionship when he said, I am with you. The promise of safety. I will keep you wherever you go. The promise of guidance and will bring you back to this land. And the promise of personal guarantee. I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. God's a loving God. Let's go to verse 16. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. Verse 17, he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. God is the gate of heaven. See, when Jacob awakened, awe overwhelmed him. Even though it said he was afraid, he was afraid and said how awesome this is. These two words really together, they capture the awe-inspiring experience, of actually someone coming into the presence of the Creator. See, Jacob responds that this place is significant because, see, it is none other than the house of God, Bethel, okay, and the gateway of heaven, and the place where heaven and earth are united. See, Jesus will eventually serve as this bridge between heaven and earth, John 1:51 again, finally bringing the Bible story to complete unity in Revelations 21:3. See, when Jacob awakens, he recognizes the nature of this place, which involves the three steps. He identifies the sadness of the spots, okay? He identifies the sacredness of the spots. Portals were associated with sacred places. So since Jacob had seen a portal here, he identified this space as a sacred space, the house of God. And see, this house of God is at the earth end of the portal, okay, where the other end of the portal is the gate of heaven, okay? All right, let's go to verse 18 and 19. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head, and he sat it on a pillar, and he poured oil on it. He called that place, Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Okay? So when Jacob rises the next morning, he consecrates the site. He's conscious that he had met God there. He gave the place a sacred name. He changed the name of the place from Luz, which means separation, to Bethel, the house of God. 28:19. See, and he did this because of his experience, and then he makes a vow, okay? And see, this act was to worship the God who had appeared to him by turning the headpiece into a pillar. This act, it memorialized the great experience that he had been that he had that night. Okay? And see, by pouring oil on the stone, he was consecrating it to God. He didn't use the stone as an altar or make a sacrifice. He simply set it apart as a memorial. And see, and so what had been originally a dark place had become a sacred place. Let's go to verses 20 through 22. See, then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. Some look at this and says, Jacob seems to be bargaining with God, okay? He was actually bargaining for less than what God had promised, if you go back and look at verse 14. See, his faith was not strong enough yet to take God at his word. We all have that. We all go through that. Well, God, you do this, for me. If you do this for me, then I'll do this for you. Just literally listen to how that sounds. God, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. Well, and that's kind of like how it was, Jacob's vow was coming out. See, and that happens when we're not strong yet, strong in our faith, okay? So even though Jacob had to made his tithe conditional on God's performance, it's kind of, some folks look at it as really another kind of interpretation, so to speak, from the Hebrew oaths, that is, that Jacob was binding himself to give a tenth unconditionally. And some of the verses you can go back and check, like Numbers 21:2, or Judges 11:30, just some to look at. So, although some think that Jacob was bargaining with God for the very things that God had just promised him, others think that this was a general vow given in thankfulness to God, like the ones we find in Psalms, as an example, in which the one who prayed promised to pay honor to and offer sacrifices to God when the prayers were answered. So, even so, Jacob's vow was made in response to a promise of blessing that he really did not request, but God, in his grace, gave it to him. Okay? Also, when we look at it and say, since there is no temple or priesthood at Bethel, so to whom would Jacob give his tithe? Well, Jacob most likely anticipated that any wealth coming to him would be in the form of flocks and also in herds. And so in such case, the tithe really would be presented in sacrifices at Bethel, which is recorded in Genesis 30. Well, in Genesis 35, it does not necessarily mention the sacrifices being made, but it does mention about building an altar there, and thereby making it all the more likely that he's fulfilling his parts of his vow by sacrifices. So other aspects look at it from this end. So there was also a more, I'll call it an intangible element to Jacob's promise. See, the Lord will be my God. It's not an accident that in this situation, as some translations make it, Jacob uses this word, in some translations that is, he uses more the term Elohim, okay? As in verse 20. But see, in verse 21, he specifically names God as his God. And in other words, if providence smiles on him as he's promised, returns Jacob to his land, he will recognize that God is behind that providence and is guiding his destiny. And in Genesis 35, it records Jacob's fulfillment of this vow. He carries out this part by just simply setting aside other gods in 35:2. Okay? But most importantly, Jacob, he dedicates himself to the Lord that morning, and he claimed the promises that God had made to him in Genesis 28:13-15. So, the if you do this, then I will do this, okay? Well, this if now is found in many translations not to really mean if, but to mean, to be read as since. Since God, you did this for me, I'm doing this for you, okay? See, Jacob wasn't really, in some instances, making a bargain with God. He was affirming his faith in God. And since God had promised to care for him, to be with him, and to bring him back home safely, then Jacob would affirm his faith in God and would seek to worship and to honor him alone. See, Jacob didn't have an easy life in the years that followed after this. For though God forgave his sins, and was with him in his journey, Jacob suffered the consequences of his sin, as we all will and do, okay? See, God in his grace forgives us, but God in his righteousness, direction, he sees to it that we reap what we sow. So, Jacob had deceived Isaac, but his father-in-law, Laban, lied to Jacob and deceived him. Jacob used the kid to deceive his father, and Jacob's son used the kid to deceive their father, 37, 29, 35. Okay? And see, during the years he worked for Laban, Jacob endured many trials, both as a shepherd and as the husband of 4 wives and the father of many children. Okay? 31 and 36. Okay? And the things that kept him going when the going was tough was his faith in the promises of God. See, God promised to be with him, and that's what Jacob depended on, okay? And the Lord did not fail him, nor will he fail us. See, the Lord of hosts is with us, and the God of Jacob is our refuge. So, as we go to conclusion here, got a few more things that I want to share with you, and then we'll wrap up completely for the month. See, prior to Genesis 28, we really have only seen Jacob in more of what I would say a negative light, that is, a negative light of his character. See, there was no real insight offered concerning his spiritual conditioning, his relationship with God, prior to, 28 and 12, okay? And there was, we have no cause to think of him really as more of being a godly individual. Matter of fact, in this chapter, we really can't paint a picture of Jacob as a man of faith with insight into the character of God, because we just don't have all of that until we get to later on into the chapters of Genesis. Because we don't know how he was living. Well, actually, we know how he was living. He wasn't living as righteously as we would like for him to have been. So consequently, when we look through all of this, we do not have really, can't read Jacob's vow, against the background of devotional commitments here. We kind of read it in light of what we have seen of Jacob thus far. And we kind of look at it somewhat like, it's kind of like a bargain. However, this is not like a vow in which a request is made and a vow attached so that it recognizes God's role can be indicated. See, God has made a statement of his intentions, but Jacob has shown a bit of skepticism here, okay? Even though he was awestruck by the dream, he still, in effect, demands that God prove himself before he can expect any response from Jacob. Well, let's just kind of speed up here so that we remain time here. But in this case, we look at the contrast of God placing conditions on Abram, to leave his country so that the promises can be realized. And see, in this case here, it's kind of backwards. Jacob kind of puts conditions on God before God can become the beneficiary of the promises. Okay? See, Jacob, in his vow, he presumes on the grace of God. Everything is backwards here, and it's somewhat of an intolerable situation that we will have to fix before God can proceed with Jacob. See, Jacob is more scoundrel than saint, so to speak, okay? Because he treats God as a passenger along for the ride, whereas God insists, and rightly so, okay, on being in the driver's seat. We also see Jacob here as a work in process. It's another one of God's reclamation projects. He's building him. He's building up. See, Jacob has done nothing to deserve God's attention, yet God reaches out to him at a time when he's probably feeling nothing but despair and vulnerability. See, God encourages Jacob by his presumption and comforts him with his promises. See, it is important to see that God does not wait on people to arrive, okay? He doesn't wait on to arrive at a spiritual maturity before making overtures to them, okay? So, a little story here. It's kind of like this. You look at Jacob in this light, and you imagine an elementary school teacher, commending one of her pupils, for doing a good job on writing a 1-paragraph essay and indicating to the student here that the aptitude, that they have an aptitude to be a really good writer, only to have that student respond back. And this is a little elementary school kid responding back by indicating to the teacher that she should be so privileged to train someone with such talent. Okay, that's kind of like how you look at the situation here with Jacob. And see, but one might expect the teacher to be a bit outraged on the inside. On the inside at least a little bit about the arrogance and the conceit that this little student is showing. But you know what? A good teacher would perhaps indulge it and even excuse it. Okay? So point of the matter is that God is a good teacher. He's full of patience and grace. And despite our arrogance and conceit, dare we interpret small signs of his pleasures with our minuscule endeavors and achievement. Okay? They pale compared to how awesome our God is. Dare we indicate to God the terms of our commitment or suggest that our service will only be rendered when he proves himself worthy? Dare we presume on his grace? That is what Jacob is doing when he makes his vow. Okay? There is a tale, and I wish I had a lot more time to share with you. Well, I'm going to try. We got about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to try. Okay? But there's this poor fisherman. He lived in a ramshacked hut by the docks with his wife. She was a difficult woman with an attitude of greatness had she not been held back by their social status and by her husband's humble occupation as a fisherman and their paltry income. So one day while fishing, the man caught an unusual fish. He thought that he might be able to get 2 meager meals out of it for himself and his wife, so he was happy. How surprised he was when the fish spoke to him as it laid in the bottom of the boat. Fish said, "Throw me back." It pleaded, "For I am a magical fish. If you spare my life, I will grant you any wish." Well, the man was of a generous nature, and he agreed to the fish's suggestion. But being a content man, he could not think of a wish. Finally, it was suggested that perhaps the fish could give him a new hut with no cracks between the boards so that he and his wife could live, would not be cold in the winter months. Okay? So the fish said his new hut would be waiting for him when he arrived home. Moreover, he thought if he thought of any other wishes, he should come back to the dock and call to the fish, and his wish would be granted. Well, when the man got home, his wife was curious about the circumstances that had happened and transformed their dilapidated hut into a fine, sturdy one. The man told the story about the fish, but as he was recounting the details of it, the wife's face grew redder and redder until it looked as if it was about to burst. The woman said to him, "A pitiful excuse for a husband you are if you cannot take any more concern for your poor wife's welfare than to make her live in a fisherman's hut, however sturdy it might be. If you cared about me at all, you might at least ask for a cozy little house with a green front door and a fireplace to warm yourself by." The man felt chastised at his thoughtlessness, and he agreed to go back to the fish the next day to see if he could provide the cozy cottage his wife described. Well, the next day he went back to the fish and made his wife's request, and the fish responded with a flip of the tail and said it was done. Okay, so anyway, the man returned home glad that the matter was settled, but on arriving at the home, he found that all was not well with his wife. She was pacing around in front of the fireplace, but dissatisfied. Now she said she wanted a mansion. So the next day, the man went back to the dock, talked to the magical fish. With apologies, he explained the situation, but the fish showed no irritation as he granted the wish as easily as he had the others. But as might be expected, soon as the man got back home, even the mansion was unacceptable. The wife now wanted a castle, complete with ballroom. The man shuffled slowly to the dock the next day, his mind reeling with humiliation at what he was asking. The fish appeared, and as a fish face could show pity, that is what you would have seen on the fish. See, the fisherman sadly and reluctantly conveyed his wife's latest demands, and the fish only replied, "Then the castle is what you shall have." So, that night they had their first ball in the castle, and all the finest lords and ladies attended. The orchestra played, and the people danced and socialized with one another. From each guest, you could be hearing conversations of power and status, success and wealth. The next morning, the wife spoke again to her husband. Our castle is magnificent, and the ball was grand, but we still are a fisherman and his wife, and not accepted by the fine folk of society. Tell the fish to make us charming and appealing in the eyes of our society. Well, the man delayed going to the docks as long as he dared, but he knew he could not face his wife without speaking to the fish. So he went to the dock and he called the fish, who emerged and asked what was to be done. The man was very hesitant. It took some time and persuasion from the fish to convince the man to blurt out the latest request. And he said, my wife wants you to give us a social status befitting our home, this castle. The fish grinned, if a fish could grin. He flipped his tail and declared it was done. When the fisherman returned home, he was surprised to find his wife sitting outside the original dilapidated shack. She had been crying, but when she looked into her husband's eyes, it was clear that she was a wiser woman. The fish had indeed granted their wish. Their social status was befitting to their home. Having come to respect herself and her husband for who they were, the woman was never again discontent, but enjoyed the life of a fisherman's wife. See, in this story, the fisherman had done a favor for the fish, which served as the premise for the request, though certainly the request in time far exceeded the favor. See, in our lives, we may imagine we have done God a favor and deserve his attention and blessing. But no one can make that a premise for requesting blessings. See, the reason is that God has done far more for us in sending his son to die for us. Whatever we do, whatever we do for God is small repayment compared to what all he's done for us. See, God has unlimited grace. Yet in our attitudes, we can presume upon his grace and try him with our own selfish requests. This is the element that has been well illustrated in the story about the fish. Too often our requests of God focus on our material gain, recovery of wealth, success and adventure, pleasant circumstances, etc. Perhaps God would be pleased if more of our requests focus on spiritual gain, stronger faith, purification of thought, straightening out of our attitudes, patience in hardship, love for those we find difficult to love, sensitivity to his leading, and increased commitment to his service. See, these are the sort of requests that never presume upon his grace. Okay. See, they will achieve his purpose of helping us come to an understanding of our true nature and our dependence on him. Okay. Note, though the woman's status changed, her character did not. Okay. In the end, it was unaltered character that caused her lack of acceptance by the fine lords and ladies and brought her back to where she started. Okay. Like Jacob and the fisherman's wife, we too can be bogged down by our character flaws. Like the fisherman's wife, those flaws may hamper any progress that we may potentially make, though perhaps like Jacob, we may, with God's help, overcome them as God transforms sinners into servants. Thank you. It's been a pleasure discussing God's word with you today. Thanks. Have a great day. Goodbye. And may God bless you.